Welcome everybody to tonight's Omaha Table Talk. My name is Dominic Green. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Programs and Faculty Manager at Inclusive Communities. Before we start tonight's conversation, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the traditional homelands of the Native and Indigenous people who lived and took care of the land that most of us gather on tonight. That land belonged to the Omaha, Ponca, Pawnee, Oto, Missouri, Santee Dakota Sioux, Kansas, Iowa, Cheyenne, and Winnebago people. We honor with gratitude and pay our respects to all Native and Indigenous people. Omaha Table Talks, or we also refer to them as OTTs, was initially recreated in Omaha in 2003 by the Social Justice Advisory Committee of Catholic Charities, Omaha. In 2012, Inclusive Communities acquired Omaha Table Talk and shifted to a larger public discussion format over comfort food. Now, during COVID-19, we have had to shift to holding these events over Zoom, but we still welcome you to have a snack or some food with you and a beverage during these discussions. We are also always looking for ways to grow and get better at these events, and so invite you to please fill out tonight's evaluation that will be shared out at the end of tonight's event. This time I'd like to thank our sponsors for the Omaha Table Talk series, Lozier Foundation, Cox Communications, and American Family Insurance. I'm going to toss it over to Colin, my colleague here, who's going to help share some housekeeping and moderate housekeeping with everybody.
Thanks, Dominic. Awesome. Yeah, just a couple of things before we got the conversation started. The first, you might have noticed this session is being recorded. So just know that that's happening. But when we do go to those breakout rooms and table discussions, none of those conversations will be recorded. We will also be doing some digital or some share outs as well, but we'll kind of get to the functioning of that a little bit later. I'd also like to acknowledge Pam Duncan, our ASL interpreter, who will hopefully be pinned during this whole conversation if you do need to utilize her services. Also, we do have a closed captioning feature as well, which Dominic will initiate so that you can have that service as well available to you. We also are joined by some of our volunteer facilitators. So if you are a facilitator, go ahead and just give a wave in your Brady Bunch square there. And then we do have some digital agreements as well, or some virtual agreements, I should say, that just helps to ensure we kind of have a smooth conversation on this particular platform. The first one, we just always encourage folks to be on camera when kind of engaging in the discussion, especially in those breakout rooms, keeping yourself on mute, but always being ready to participate in those small breakout room discussions, remaining engaged and minimizing other kind of distractions. But feel free to utilize the chat or any other sort of nonverbal reactions throughout this presentation and discussion, as well as in those breakout rooms. And then finally, you've probably seen several folks do this already, but we would love for you to change your name to include your first name and pronouns, just to make sure that we're referring to folks in the ways in which they want to be in this particular space. But I think that's all I have over here. And so I'll throw it back to you, Dominic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Colin. And so tonight we have a great, an awesome panel for you. And so to introduce that panel and to get things started, I'm going to kick it off by introducing our moderator tonight, Dr. Jonathan Benjamin-Alvarado, who's the Assistant Vice Chancellor and Professor of Political Science at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Jonathan.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. We're so very happy that all you folks can be with us. And I just want to make sure that you understand that we're here to have a really vigorous conversation about our topic today. And so we have two very special guests that I will introduce and then let them talk a little bit about themselves so that you can get familiar with them. And then I have some questions. I want to launch right into this because I think that this is a very rich subject that needs to be unpacked a little bit more. And so to begin, I want to introduce one of my first guest today, Jahne Maddock. Jahne, if you want to go ahead and just unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, so my name is Jahne Maddock. I am presently living in San Diego, California, but I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and I am working to be admitted to the California State Bar to be able to practice as an attorney.
Great, thank you. And our second guest is Senator Terrell McKinney. Senator.
How y'all doing? Again, Senator Terrell McKinney. I represent District 11, which is North Omaha in the state legislature, and I'm excited for the conversation tonight.
Great, well, let's get into it. So to begin, I want to share a little story with y'all because I think it's going to really try to set the context here, and then I want to engage our two speakers in a bit of a conversation. So a few years back, I think 2013 to be exact, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UNO asked me to teach a class, any class that I wanted to teach, but it had to be an introduction to politics, as you know. And so I thought long and hard, and about that very same time, there was a real spike in the number of arrests that local law enforcement were picking up individuals who were transporting marijuana from Colorado primarily through the I-80 corridor and you know, sending them to other parts across the country. And at that time also, there was a consideration in the Nebraska state legislature to have medical marijuana legalized. There had been some significant breakthroughs in the area of the treatment of epilepsy. And so there was a real robust conversation about what that might look like in the state of Nebraska. And lo and behold, the bill was introduced and it subsequently went nowhere. But it gave me the idea that I could perhaps teach a course on the politics of marijuana, because I knew then, as we are now talking about today, there is a real distinct possibility that we may, in the not too distant future, and some of us had hoped earlier, that we would have had legalization of marijuana, both recreational and medical, for the state of Nebraska. And as a consequence, it raises a whole bunch of questions. And so I've got two individuals who I believe are very well versed in the topic and ready to kind of jump in and engage in a conversation with us on this topic. And it'll lead you into some of the questions you're going to be getting into when you get into your little breakout rooms in a few minutes. And so I've got about a half an hour or so to kind of dig into this a little bit. And let me begin as the general question for both of our panelists today, for Jahne and Senator McKinney. From each of your perspective, what does decriminalization of marijuana laws look like in the state of Nebraska?
Well, I can go first. I know technically the definition of decriminalization is the act of removing, criminal sanctions against a specific act or article or behavior. And so when it comes to marijuana, that would include, smoking, possession. In some cases, it could include distribution. And when it comes to decriminalization, instead of getting prison time or jail time, depending on how large your possession is, you would have like no fine at all. You would get like a civil sanction. You could be sent to drug education or like drug treatment versus having to go, spend tax dollars on leaving these individuals in jails and prisons for such a nonviolent offense as marijuana. That's my personal view of it.
Great. Senator, jump on in with this one.
For me, decriminalization in Nebraska would look like individuals not being pulled over for the smell of marijuana, individuals not receiving citations and having to go to court and pay fines and fees because they have possession of marijuana. Decriminalization also looks like the clearing of records of individuals that in the past had, offenses on the record for marijuana possession and things like that. And hopefully, I'm not sure how many people would be, but I'm sure there's individuals in our county jails and our state prisons who because of marijuana are sitting inside, and hopefully a lot of those individuals could be released. And that's what decriminalization will look like for me.
I gotta unmute myself here. So how does that differ then from what the two of you have just provided for us, which thank you very much for that. How does that differ from the legalization of marijuana, both in terms of what it looks like to do that recreationally and for medical marijuana uses? What does that look like?
Well, for me, legalization, being in California, I could walk around the corner, there would be a dispensary, I could walk in, I could purchase as I'm older than 21. You can't smoke it out in public, but you can possess up to a certain amount and not be in trouble for it. And also with the legalization, there should be expungement of criminal records with people who have been charged with possession or related singularly only drug offenses. I know some drug offenses come with other charges, but legalization just removes all prohibitions. You can't go to jail for it unless you could still technically illegally be selling it because you don't have the license for it, but those could be fines versus jail time.
Senator, what do you got to say about this one?
I agree with what she said as well. Legalization will look like the ability to go around the corner and go to the dispensary whenever you want it, and purchase marijuana or anything that is associated with marijuana. It's also the expungement of records and clearing of records of individuals who in the past have been, in my opinion, disproportionately affected by marijuana laws in our country, and also due to the the war on drugs. So for me, it would look like just like going to the store to get a case of beer and not feeling bad that, oh, I'm going in to get some beer, hopefully nobody sees me. It's not to advocate for it, but it's also, that's what legalization looks like, because honestly, I know you guys had some fact sheets up previously, but once you dive deep into the history of the prohibition of marijuana, you realize that it's not necessarily prohibited because it's harmful. It was led by propaganda and racist policies in the past.
Yes, I agree with that. I actually have notes because I think it's very important when you're talking about the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of marijuana and personally other considered hard drugs. They're all strive from, laws, which I think I have written down. One of President Nixon's top aides actually admitted that the campaign, there was two enemies. You had, the anti-left who did not like war. And then you had, and quote, he said, Black people. Like marijuana criminalization was their way to attack the Black population without verbalizing and saying, oh, we're attacking these people because we don't like them. We don't want them here. Let's go this roundabout way. And not only Black people, I know that Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants were also targeted with marijuana laws. So I think, it's considered a Schedule I drug federally still, but you have to look at the background. Like it was outlawed for a outrageous reason, and they just decided to stick with it.
Mm-hmm. And because it's a Schedule I, it's classified to be the same thing as heroin, methamphetamine, and other fentanyl and other really, really high impact chemically based drugs, as opposed to marijuana, which is, natural in nature. So both of you have already talked about the idea of expungement. That means to clear the record of an individual who has been convicted of a crime associated with marijuana. Does that include in your mind both misdemeanors and felonies?
Yes.
Okay, so if an individual had been caught trafficking marijuana, he's one of the guys going down I-80 with 42 pounds of some real good indica on its way to Chicago, that individual should be released?
I think so. I think we should start fresh. You know, I honestly do. Now, if it becomes legal and you're found to be illegally selling marijuana, that's a different story, but let's start fresh. Now, if you caught me illegally selling alcohol, I can understand why I'm getting, you know, a misdemeanor or a felony, but let's start fresh. Because I think to not start fresh, it ignores a huge piece of why a lot of individuals are arguing for it to be legalized, because of what we stated previously, the policies that led to its prohibition.
Okay, so Senator McKinney, I want to pick on you for a second, but I'm not really picking on you. It's because I know you have a good answer for me. Can you explain to us the pending legislation that was introduced this year in the Nebraska unicameral on behalf of decriminalization and legalization of marijuana?
So I introduced a bill. It's the Marijuana Clean Slate Act, and what it would do would clear the records of individuals who in the past have marijuana offenses on their record. The reason I brought it is because if we're having a conversation about legalizing anything medical or, you know, just a full legalization, we have to talk about clearing these convictions. And the biggest reason is currently I could get on my phone right now and purchase cannabis stocks on the stock market while countless individuals are sitting inside of our prisons across the country for doing the same thing, and it makes no sense.
Right. I actually, I have a comment to that as well. You know, in California, they wrote in as a part of a law, there was supposed to be an expungement of records, but you have a backup in the courts not doing what they said they were going to do. You still have tons of people in jail and prison in California for charges like that. So I also feel like with bringing this legislation, you know, we need to understand, like, it's not just the legislature legalizing it. We also need the courts doing their part and actually expunging the records and, you know, providing an easy route. I think I saw there's a website where in California, you can just go log in and type in your information. And it's like expunge my record, and you can get it done that way. But I definitely think that it's something that needs to be taken care of, because it's very easy for people to just brush aside these individuals who are still in jail and prison, even while marijuana is being legalized.
You know, I'm really glad you raised that. When I taught that course, I had the students become the Judiciary Committee of the Nebraska State Legislature. And when it got to committee, one of it wasn't passed to the whole legislature, because what the students realized was the point that you were talking about. While certainly we're really happy to legalize the purchase of marijuana, the bill did not include what they believe was a requisite amount of basically bureaucracy behind it to do all the things that they wanted the bill to do. And that would be, you know, taking perhaps some of the money from marijuana and utilizing that to help the courts expunge and to, you know, hire more people to do that process, because it does take time. And I'm really happy that you folks have raised that, because it kind of lets people know really how complex this issue is. It will be, you know, I think a good thing for us to do in society, but there's a lot of things that are tied to that. And it leads me to the next question that I have for you. So suppose legislation and decriminalization come to pass, and I believe that it eventually will. How do we ensure that the licensing and the regulation of sales and dispensaries of marijuana in Nebraska is equitable? And what I mean by that, does this mean that BIPOC, biracial and people of color will have access to the commercial opportunities associated with these changes in the law?
I would say it's tough in Nebraska because you can't specifically write it into law because we don't have affirmative action, but there's ways around it. But I would say we have to write in those policies that, you know, for instance, if we're given 200 permits for dispensaries, a certain percentage of those individuals have to come from a certain area of the city, or some individuals have to be system impacted and things like that. So I think we would have to definitely get creative in the language of the policies, because we can't just outright say 20% of the permits go to Black and brown individuals, because we don't have affirmative action.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, you can't erase, disproportionality like that. I learned that in law school, but I don't know if anyone does. I follow Ben and Jerry's on Instagram, and they are partnered with the ACLU, and they actually posted, just right along the lines with 420 being today, some cannabis facts and statistics, which bring up, the licensure and everything like that. So they stated that 81% of cannabis business owners are white, whereas only 4.3% are Black. And it's interesting when you say that, because Black people, even with the legalization of marijuana, are still 264% more likely than white people to be arrested for cannabis possession. So even with the legality of marijuana these days and everything like that, you still have the disproportionality affecting minorities, which then makes it a bigger picture. We know that minorities are, economically disadvantaged, which that goes towards licensures. You have banks who don't give people of color loans. You have, businesses who don't want to partner up. You have all these other aspects where even if we were to write in laws like that, you still have the issue of it's the bigger picture, that it's not just marijuana, it's the whole systemic racism that is going on.
Right, and I agree. I think you also have to give more access to capital, because you drive around Omaha now and you see all these CBD shops that are honestly just there in hopes that once the legalization comes, they're already there and already set up. But how many of those CBD shops are owned by Black and brown individuals? So we have to make sure that with legalization, we find ways to provide more access to capital equitably. If not, we still have the disproportionality, and white people still benefit off of marijuana. And the ones who were most affected for years are still on a low end of the totem pole.
It's so ironic that you should raise that point, because it reminds me a little bit of the payday lending issue in the state of Nebraska. You see all these little places popping up. And I remember I had some students in a class kind of do some work on it. And almost all of them were owned by banks and corporations based in Texas. It seems to be like a new cottage industry for the financial sector in Texas to own payday lending facilities all over the country. The same thing is already happening with marijuana sales in those places where it's legal. I know that there's been a really big tug of war with trying to keep things local as opposed to out of the hands of people who are able to buy stock in it, or to have, huge amounts of capital to be able to go up and set up a shop, because it's not cheap. We're talking tens of millions of dollars in terms of what it's going to cost to set up a dispensary, because there has to be all kinds of security protocols, background checks, so on and so forth, licensing fees. And it's not for the weak of heart. Granted, it's a very lucrative business, but I think that, if we're going to talk about equity in all of this, this has to be part of the discussion. And Senator McKinney, you did raise the point that, we don't necessarily practice affirmative action here in the state of Nebraska, but I'm glad that you're considering the workarounds, because everybody does have to get creative, and that is indeed the case. And it leads me to my next question, and I think this is going to be ripe for a lot of discussion, both with us as a panelist, but I think also with people when they go into their breakout rooms. So hypothetically, or maybe not, the tax revenue from marijuana sales is going to be significant. I'm just going to give you a quick example. Colorado has raised more than $1.6 billion in tax revenue since they legalized marijuana in 2013. What should the state of Nebraska do if they get that kind of a windfall? I know what the governor would like to say. He'd say we want to give everybody a tax break. But what should the state do? Colorado is using it for education. Other states are doing things similar to that.
I will, just to add to your point, the Ben & Jerry's also stated that cannabis sales hit a high of 17.5 billion in just 2020. So it is a very lucrative business opportunity. And I think personally that the funds should be going towards this for similar reasons why people say, defund the police. Why are they getting all this money? All of that stuff needs to be put back into the community, whether it's, rebuilding parts of the community, whether it's putting it into education or mental health or any of those things. I feel like putting the money back into the community is what matters.
And I agree 100% with you. I think a lot of the resources should go back to the community for education, mental health, economic development for small business and entrepreneurs, providing access to capital for disadvantaged communities as well. So I wouldn't say just education, because just giving it the education doesn't address the long years of discrimination. You have to go across the board to really address those issues.
Well, I also think just putting it in towards education, I went through college and I went to law school, but pursuing school is not what everyone wants. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we're in a day and age where we aren't forced to be going to school. We have other opportunities that, we can go through. So I think just narrowing it to education is too narrow.
So we've got 6 minutes left. And I really first want to thank the both of you for really getting this going. You've got me thinking a lot here, because that I think would be the ultimate challenge. And if you could, pitch it appropriately to the people of the state of Nebraska, there's a lot of infrastructure needs. To Terrell's point, the fact of the matter is, it's not just about education. It is about perhaps improving infrastructure. And by that, I mean our mental health and social service infrastructure. If we know anything about what's happened in Nebraska over the course of the past couple of years, especially with health and human services, it's an absolute disaster. We need to put a lot more attention to it. We need to be, I think, educating mental health counselors, en masse, especially given the collective trauma that all of us have experienced during the pandemic. I mean, if anybody tells you they've flown through it without any kind of disruption, they're lying to you. It's that dramatic. And I think that we're already discovering it here at the university. I imagine in the public schools, it's much the same. And what about the broader society? I want to quote my good friend, Mark Foxall, who used to be the executive director of the Douglas County Corrections Center, when he said that on any Saturday night, the largest mental institution in the state of Nebraska was a Douglas County jail. And so I think it could lead into the conversation about the things that you folks have already introduced. So I want to give each of you just a kind of a minute or so to kind of wrap it up. Give us some of your final thoughts on your perspective on this. I think we got a good idea, but if you got any nuggets of wisdom you want to share with us, by all means, please do. And we'll go ladies first.
Well, personally, I think that, with all of the negativity around marijuana, it's definitely we need a wide change of mindsets. The drug is very helpful for, specific mental illnesses, as well as it helps with anxiety and everything. So I do think that this is something that should be passed in Nebraska, hopefully sooner rather than later, both recreationally and medically. And I also know that I believe the ACLU is trying to pass the MORE Act with the federal government, which is also would legalize it recreationally and medically federally. So I think if that's something that would happen, Nebraska would have no choice but to get behind that. So
Senator, you get the last word.
I would say, it's time that we really start to deconstruct the war on drugs, and for this country and for this nation to start doing right by those that have been most affected by it. I think, economically, it's a smart decision, but humanly, just for the human race or for human rights, I just think it's fair that we begin to decriminalize and legalize marijuana and start providing resources to those most affected by the prohibition of this of marijuana. It's a fight, but I believe sooner than later that the fight will end and we'll have legalization and decriminalization. I'm hopeful that President Biden steps up and leads the charge, so we don't have to rely on our governor to try to do something which is not going to happen. And I guess lastly, I would just say, peace to the family of George Floyd and George Floyd himself. And I hope that they can sleep a little better tonight. I know it still won't be easy, and there's still a lot more fights to come. But I'm hopeful and thinking about his family.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I want to thank you both for this time with us this evening. I'm ready to kick it back over to our good friend, Dominic. Dominic, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all for that great conversation. At the end, if we have some time, we'll possibly have some time for some Q&A to Jonathan and the panelists. So at this point, Colin's going to take us into our breakout rooms for our breakout discussions and lead us through what some community breakout room agreements look like.
Sweet, thanks, Dominic. Yeah, the only thing too that I would remind before we went into those breakout rooms is we do like a little share out portion after the breakout room. So if you all first thing when you get into those rooms want to deliberate who wants to do that share out, that's always nice to get done ahead of time. But in terms of how to make this space in those agreements, in those breakout rooms the best that they can be, we just have these couple little rules here. The first just being one mouth, one mic, just doing proper turn taking. The Vegas twist, knowing that the stories stay like those, providing some sort of anonymity, but allowing those lessons to leave. Making space and taking space and being conscious of airtime, keeping an open mind, and then also just engaging in general respect. So with that, it will automatically put you in those breakout rooms where a facilitator has some pre-scripted questions to lead you all through, and then it will also automatically bring you back. So here we go.
All right, welcome back. I hope you all had some good conversations. We're going to go into the third part of this event, and that's sharing out and discussing some maybe call to action items as well that we've discussed on how to be better advocates for this topic. So first, if we could have somebody from Denise's group, and that can either be Denise or somebody from that group who would like to share out about 2 items or objectives that you all talked about.
It's going to be me because the comfort level. So I guess the 2 we talked about a lot. The one things that we talked about was how you rectify things that happen to people in the past, even if it gets legalized and people get expunged, like some of the damage has already been done, and how does that, how does that go about? And then how to get people of influence and power to also tell a different story than what has been told in the state of Nebraska, and to share the statistics, to understand the policy, and spread the word to the other side, I guess, was the 2 items. I don't know, I'm going to share.
Thank you.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
thank you for sharing. Okay, moving on to the group that Keaton facilitated. Who would like to share out from this group? Again, just 2 highlights that you all talked about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share back with the group. There's a lot of great discussion, but a couple things that really jumped out, particularly towards the end of the discussion about, really what's the, when we think about addressing these disparities, what needs to happen first? And there were a couple of things. One was just, there's a lot more to learn. So completing that discussion, finding ways to reach a consensus, and, understanding our bias. So just continuing and completing that discussion around really understanding what it is we're dealing with regards to this. And then another really important point was, through all this, consistently inviting curiosity, and that notion that, when you hear about particularly this topic with racial disparity and marijuana laws, like really encouraging the curiosity and giving people that, inciting them to want to learn more and understand. And it goes back to some degree the biases that you have about it, but approaching it, I think one of the people said, like kids, they love to learn and they love to learn new things, and approaching it in that way and being curious about it. So I think those were some really excellent points.
Awesome, thank you. Our next group was led by Jamel. Who would like to share out 2 highlights?
Oh, that would be me. So we talked about the amount of money that Colorado has made and how it would be an excellent thing for Nebraska to have that same access to funds to improve things and to do right by the people who are most affected by the criminalization of marijuana, possession, that kind of thing. And then we also talked about how we could start with decriminalization and expunging those folks who are either out or still behind bars, expunging their records and helping them find a pathway to become employed with those funds.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. And then our last group was facilitated by Nicole Mitchell. And again, it can be somebody even within the group who would like to share out 2 or 3 highlights from what you all talked about.
All right, so what we talked about, it was really interesting. We talked about decriminalization, but we talked about how it's so complex, how you cannot just decriminalize in one area because it's such a complex system. So that was one thing that we talked about. And then 2 things that we got out of it was understanding the biases. There were 2 examples in regards of where they had to go back and check themselves because of their biases of a decision that they had made in regards of one was working in the school, and then one was living in an apartment where her neighbor would smoke marijuana and it would come through the vents. And so it was a choice of, do I call the police or do I not? And so she made up in her mind to, not be that person to do it. And then with the teacher, it was understanding the impact. And so that was the other thing that came out of our conversation, understanding the impact that it has on a child from the pipeline to prison. And so where if you just smell it on a kid, they can literally, stop a kid in regards of that. And so right there is the start of the pipeline to prison. So we got out of that decriminalizing in one area. It's just too complex. There's no way that you can do it. And then 2, understanding your biases and how they affect and how they impact others, especially when working with youth, how one decision can literally affect the youth for the rest of their life. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing, and thank you to all the breakout room facilitators for sharing out. We do actually have some time, so we're going to go into some Q&A with our moderator and panelists. So I'm going to start off with a question that we were talking about while you all were in your breakout rooms. So I'm giving you all some time to think of a question if you have one, and put it in the chat or use the raise hand function in Zoom to let us know that you might have a question in the queue, and I'll pull it out next. So the question that we were talking about in the chat, so how can we talk about how we can go about dismantling some of the myths that are so dangerous regarding marijuana? Let me open this up to either Jonathan or the panelists, any of you.
I would say, get educated on the facts, and I know you guys will provide some research and some data that will assist with this, but also having those conversations with family and friends to say, hey, what you're saying isn't correct, and bring the facts, which are like, look, this is what it is. Like, what you believed in the past isn't true, and start building from there. I think we have to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations about this topic and making it more normal, and not stray away from it because somebody may feel a certain way about it. I think until we get uncomfortable being until we get comfortable being uncomfortable about this subject, it'll take some time, but I think, you know, the tide is shifting to, you know, more individuals being willing to just have an open mind and listen. And I think that's where we start.
Yeah, I think, you know, the one thing I want to acknowledge up front is that myths are powerful motivators for human behavior. You know, most of us operate on the basis of myths, misinformation, or half-truths a lot of the time. And so the way that you convince people is by continuously demonstrating to them, not that they're wrong, but there's a different way of looking at this. And that only comes by engaging people in conversation. I think that's one of the things we've gotten too far away from. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to participate with you folks tonight, is that this really is a good launching point. You know, I wish there was 200 people on the call so that they could kind of also get a little bit of a chance to listen to some of the discussion and to be engaged with other people, you know, in a respectful manner. And I think somebody made a comment earlier that, you know, more often than not, you know, the people that are the most ardent opponents probably have some deep-seated reason as to why, and it has absolutely nothing to do with marijuana. It probably does have something to do with some other form of bias that I think Keaton had presented in his report out. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about that, but also understanding this stuff is hard to bust through, you know? I mean, had a whole TV show for years and years, Mythbusters, you know? So.
Yeah, I also agreed, you know, just having conversations, but also understanding that as long as there are people in power and people of influence, you know, spitting different opinions, you're not going to be able to sway everyone. And I've experienced that with every situation we've gone towards justice. So I think acknowledging that as well, and just working to educate the people that are willing and want to be educated, because those are the ones who are going to understand how important such a change is like this.
Absolutely. So I noticed Jamel had her hand up for the next question. So Jamel, you want to come on and unmute yourself?
Sure. I just wanted to know if any of you have given any thought on if marijuana is legalized, how would you motivate employers to not use that disproportionately as compared to, say, alcohol or some other, you know, maybe prescribed medication? How would you motivate employers not to terminate employment based on the use of legal marijuana?
Well, you know, I'm going to use the same standard that I use already in my place of employment with drugs, other drugs and alcohol. But you can't be under the influence when you're on the clock. It's just as simple as that. You know, it's a matter of discipline. I mean, people, hey, I want to go out and get high at lunchtime. They come back and zone out all afternoon. Well, that, you know, I'm not having that where I work, and I don't believe anybody else. I think ultimately it's very disrespectful if you think about it. You know, why are you there? You're not there to smoke pot. You're there to work for those people. Now, granted, you know, I mean, there are some people that will always abuse it. I know there's people that go out and have a beer at lunch, you know, and eat a piece of gum and come back to work. But that being stated, I think we just have to have a common standard across the entire board that, you know, you shouldn't be under the influence of anything when you're at work. Like I said, it's really kind of a violation of company rules more likely than not. But like I said, it's also really disrespectful.
I agree. As long as you're not, you know, doing anything while you're at work, and I don't see why anybody would enact any standard to say you couldn't. I know in the medical field, or if you're a pilot or something, it's kind of different. But, you know, in the general work environment, as long as you're not under the influence of anything while you're working, which is the current standard, I don't see why there would be policies put in place just because marijuana is legal.
You know, and I would add to that there are those jobs where they drug test you on the regular when you have high tech, high impact machinery where safety and well-being is always a consideration. I would think, because you have a free choice whether or not to take that job, that you would still be subjected to drug testing there. I think it's appropriate, you know, given what those jobs demand of people. You don't want to have people operating heavy machinery whacked out. It just, you know, It's pretty straightforward. There is a question in the chat from Suzanne.
And I actually, yeah, so Ken asked a question first and then Suzanne, they both just raised their hands. So I'm gonna let them ask these questions for you here in a minute. Sorry to cut you off there.
That's all right.
Ken, I think you're muted. There you are. Oh, nope, you're still muted, sir.
Sorry. Yes, I'm Ken and I'm retired, but for 27 years, I was a mental health counselor for an employee assistance program. And so people that there was random testing at many of these companies. So EAP or employee assistance program, they contract with us when I worked there to do certain mental health and chemical dependency services. And part of it was counseling people that tested positive, or maybe they, they smelled marijuana or whatever. And then we would counsel them. And yes, there was some limited release to talk to the employer about it. But I think that would be indicated as far as dealing with, legalization or decriminalization to continue that and maybe broaden it to people that whether they work for companies or not. So I'm just saying.
Thank you for that. Would any of you like to respond or add to that?
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, I just think it makes sense. I think we have an existing practice that more often than not probably works really well. If it's not broken, there's no reason to try to fix it. And I think it should be part of that process, because it goes along with the question that he asked. He doesn't understand why decriminalizing cannabis and expunging records is so complex. I think it's a matter of will, to be honest with you. I mean, because you have to dismantle, whole bureaucracies that have been, created just to support those activities. But there's going to be additional money coming in, and I think it goes to Suzanne had a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask the question, Suzanne?
Oh, sure. So there's currently the Nebraska prison system has about 5,600 inmates. 26% are in for drug charges. So that's, 1,400 people. So I'm sure they're not all in for marijuana. But even if we assume half of them, we got 700 people that all of a sudden get exonerated or out. What resources, how are you going to provide reentry for 700 people at the same time? It's a little bit different than my chat question, but that's really my question.
I think that's a legitimate question, given the fact that, all of this costs money at some point along the journey of however individuals get involved and impacted by the legal system. And I would think that this would probably be the first place that marijuana proceeds would be dedicated to. If indeed we're going to do a dismantling of it, let's use the proceeds to begin that and to create that opportunity so that it's not unduly burdening taxpayers. We already pay for a lot of things that we don't get any return on. I mean, I think right now I think the prison system is a great example of that. How much rehabilitation is really going on in our state prisons? Not very much at all. And, and with the effort to privatize them, that's just money going into the pockets of individuals who could really care less about anything related to rehabilitation, be it drug, alcohol, or mental rehabilitation, which is the biggest issue of all in the prison system. The estimates are that perhaps 70% of all people who are incarcerated have an associated mental health condition.
From being in prison or before?
Before and after. They come out even more traumatized than when they went in. Anyway.
Oh, and I was just
wondering,
going to
Mr. McKinney, if that's even being discussed within your bill or within the conversations. What reentry are you doing for, housing for 700 people? I know it's across the state, and that's a hypothetical number.
It hasn't specifically been addressed in my bill, but the conversation about reentry has come up a lot this year, especially because the governor is trying to build a new prison. Yeah. And we're having talks that, a prison other alternatives to prison, but also making sure when individuals are released that they're not just thrown out into the streets with $100 check and say, hey, survive. We have to make sure that they have housing, transportation, IDs and, social security cards. And hopefully one day we could pass legislation that they could get access to SNAP right away. So it's definitely something to think about. And that's why we had mentioned earlier that all the resources can't just go to education, because things like reentry need to be addressed as well to make sure that those individuals aren't just thrown out and saying, figure it out.
Well, good. I just hope you carry that question forward in all the discussions, please.
And it is a very complex question that weaves together a lot of different issues that intersect, and they don't necessarily make a lot of sense. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand in the state prison system, they're required by the US laws, by civil rights law, that when an individual enters an institution and they're incarcerated, when they get out, they have to have the same level of physical and mental health well-being as they entered. And I can't tell you, I just got off of an 8-year term on Nebraska's advisory committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And we issued a study earlier last year on the impact of mental health conditions in prisons. And that's just not happening. Nobody cares. Nobody's paying any money to it to address the issue. And, all we have to have is a couple of really unsavory examples of what happens when you turn people loose who have been further traumatized than when they walked in the door, what they turn out doing in society. And I know we're getting off the topic here, but I do believe that it's associated with this broader conversation. I think it's really important here.
We have, Jahne, I didn't know, did you want to add something to that? And then we'll go to our last question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, especially talking about reentry, I think that reentry reform is needed all the way around, not just if, marijuana was legalized and you have all these other people coming out. I think reentry programs like in Nebraska, even, and all across the US need to do a better job at giving individuals an opportunity to live the life that they had then earned. They served their time. They deserve to be able to start living, but that's very hard with all of the different connotations and ideas that go behind having been to jail or prison. So I think that's just an overall mindset that also needs to change. So, because there's only so much you can do with reentry, you need also businesses and jobs and schools to be able to also help with that reentry.
Thank you for that. And so our last question will come from Nicole.
Sorry. One thing I did forget to mention, and Dr. Benjamin mentioned on this, one thing that we did talk about in our group was the mental health aspect of it. And one of the members had said that you can't talk about marijuana if you don't talk about pills. And then one of the members had mentioned that 67% of schizophrenia is within the African-American population. And so I had mentioned, I was that kid that grew up with say no to drugs, don't do drugs. They take an egg and put it in a skillet and, show you this is your brain frying. And now I'm that adult that's saying, hey, this is the positive effects of drugs, or this is, why it's good for you. So here growing up, you had the negative side effects of drugs, but now you have the positive side effects. So how do you explain to someone who grew up like that? Like, how do you know what to listen to, what to trust? How do you really inform people on the balance of marijuana?
I think that you have to tell them both the good. Oh, am I muted? No. Okay. Both the good and the bad. So I feel like very much when it comes to marijuana usage, it all depends. There are benefits, but depending on the type of person you are, there are negatives. Some people, do become very lazy. Some people, they find it hard to want motivated and do work. And I feel like it's important that we're not kind of wiping those other side effects that can happen off the table, because then we're not telling the whole truth. Where I'm scarred from the commercial where the girl is just flat up against the couch, like she's just been just deflated. But that does, although it's a very dramatic showing, that's not going to happen. Laziness does happen to some people, where some people are energetic and can do whole classes and lessons and be able to focus. I think when you're talking about the benefits, you need to talk about that. It depends on the person who is actually doing the usage as well.
I agree, definitely tell the full story. And, there's negatives to everything, which is why I wouldn't sit up here and advocate for everyone on this Zoom chat tonight to go smoke a blunt tonight. It's not for everyone. And, you make the best decision for yourself, and, hopefully you've received some of the facts behind it and in order to make the best decision. But definitely, it's not for everyone. And we definitely should be educating on the good and the bad of this conversation, because it's definitely needed as well. And, especially with drugs, even with alcohol, it's not for everybody. Tobacco is not for but I agree. It shouldn't be a one-sided conversation where we just saying it's an amazing thing and it should be legal. There's also dangers, as if with anything else, that we definitely need to discuss as well.
And so when I taught the course, I had a bunch of guest speakers. So I just said, I'm going to invite experts in to talk about this. And I had a psychologist come in, and he had actually created a cartoon on what happens to your brain when you ingest certain kinds of stimulants or depressants. And that's the way we went through explaining what happens to the brain when somebody smokes marijuana or ingests cannabis. And I have to tell you, it really created a much more informed group of students. I mean, when I polled the students first day of class, how many of you are in favor in legalizing marijuana? 75% of them said yes. When we came time to vote as the state judiciary committee to advance the legislation to the full legislature, it didn't pass because all the things we're talking about. If you decriminalize, do you have the appropriate bureaucracy to handle it? And is it going to be resourced at a level that'll make sure that it's not, people are falling through the cracks? And I really was happy that they came to that conclusion on their own. I wasn't coaching them to do that, And so I think if you give folks the right kind of information, if you lay out for them what's at stake, not only in terms of the potential financial benefits, but what it does for people, because I can guarantee you little kids who suffer from, chronic epileptic seizures probably have a much, much better life because they get to take a couple drops every morning and don't ever have that happening to them again. It's that simple in some respects. Other parts of it are more complex, but I'm just really happy you folks have put this on and we're having this conversation, Dominic. I think this is something we need to do on the regular, though. This shouldn't be a one and done. It should be an ongoing series of discussions about this, and maybe do a little bit deeper dive into what reentry programs really should look like, because I think that's as important as expunging the records, and I think that's the bigger issue for me.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nicole, for that question. And we are short on time here. We are wrapping up. So I would like to take this time to thank our moderator, Jonathan, for being here with us tonight, and our two panelists, Jahne and Senator McKinney, for being with her tonight. They did contribute to the data sheets and call to action items that you'll be able to find on there. All of that information, along with the resources and links to websites that were discussed tonight, will be shared out in an email that will be followed up later this week or early next week. So be looking for that. There's some great resources and some great ways to get more involved in this conversation and to educate yourself some more. At this time, Colin is going to share in the chat a link to our evaluation form. This is that way for you to let us know how we could improve, what you liked about the conversation tonight, or how the flow went. We're always looking for ways that we can improve in these formats. And then Alina shared a little earlier in the chat our 2 links to register for our next 2 Table Talk conversations. Our next one will be May 4th. That is again a Tuesday night, and that will be a queer table talk in partnership with Out Nebraska, specifically on the topic of youth and SOGI, which stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity Expression. And then our Omaha Table Talk on May 18th will be on the mental health disparities amongst diverse communities and diverse populations. So thank you all very much for being here tonight. I do hope that you fill out the evaluation. If you do not get a chance to fill it out tonight, a link for the evaluation will be in the email as well. And with that, have a great rest of your evening.